It's now clear that the Soviet Union has suffered one of the worst disasters in the history of nuclear power. Massive quantities of radiation have apparently been released in an accident at the Chernobyl power station in the Ukraine.
The accident at reactor number 4 was a seminal Cold War event and became etched in cultural memory as an example of the dangers of nuclear power in general and reflective of the inherent corruption within the Soviet system.
It took a full 18 days before the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev made any public pronouncement on the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl.
Добрый вечер, товарищи.
We were recently stricken by a disaster, the Chernobyl nuclear power accident. It deeply affected the Soviet people and disturbed world opinion.
To limit further release of radioactive material, emergency crews responding to the accident covered the damaged unit in a temporary concrete structure called a sarcophagus. Chernobyl is now, however, back in the news, as it seems to have been an early objective in last month's Russian invasion and war on Ukraine. And the danger of damage to Chernobyl, as well as other nuclear plants in Ukraine, remains a risk.
The Ukrainian president, he said that our defenders are giving their lives, so the tragedy of 1986 will not be repeated.
Today, on Coming In From the Cold, the Chernobyl nuclear accident, yesterday and today.
Welcome to Coming In From the Cold, a monthly podcast from CNA which explores long-forgotten or never-remembered events, policies, and strategies of the Cold War.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Coming In From the Cold. I'm Steve Wills, sitting in for Bill Rosenau, who's on assignment. Today, we're going to talk about a seminal event in the late Cold War, the April 1986 nuclear accident at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, then in the Soviet Union and now in the nation of Ukraine. We have two very special guests with us today, and because they're here and they have limited time, we'll dispense with the usual division into the historic and the modern and have a free-flowing conversation about this event. Joining me today are two members of CNA's Russia Studies program. First, Mr. Michael Kofman, who is the research program director for CNA's Russia Studies program and one of the top acknowledged experts in Russian military strategy and policy, I would say, in the world today. Welcome, Mike, and thanks for joining us on your very tight schedule.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate having me on your program.
Awesome. Also joining us today is Ms. Mary Chesnut, also a member of CNA's Russia Studies program. Mary has the unique distinction in actually having visited the Chernobyl nuclear facility and having been on the ground there. And we are very pleased to welcome you today as well, Mary. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Okay, let's jump right into the discussion here on the impact of the accident on the people of the region. We all know about the mass evacuations that happened in the wake of the Chernobyl accident, resettlement of people throughout what was then the Soviet Union and now the nations of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Mike, I wonder if you could kick it off and tell us from your perspective as a native-born Ukrainian, what the accident meant to the people of the region and how it's affected them over time. Thanks.
Well, this accident was probably one of the most high-profile disasters by far of that decade. It affected Ukraine and Belarus immensely. I remember this accident as a kid. I grew up in the capital, Kiev, at the time. Although Kiev was not immediately close to Chernobyl and Pripyat, not that far, and it wasn't clear at all that where radiation would go. The radiation release happened to blow over Belarus, unfortunately for Belarus, which was also part of the Soviet Union at the time. And my family took an impromptu evacuation south when early rumors started to swirl around the city about what had happened at Chernobyl. But, the long-term implications were profound, beyond the immediate exclusion zone, the evacuations, the thousands of workers that were affected by radiation and had cancer that was likely linked to having to work on the site, and many people died. There were millions in Ukraine that claimed to have some effect or connection to the residual effects of the radiation. There were problems with groundwater poisoning. There were problems with people entering the exclusion zone, which was sort of an abandoned dystopian landscape, and taking various objects which were irradiated and trying to resell them. There were all sorts of issues, lasting issues of ongoing contamination. The disaster itself cost billions upon billions of dollars at the time. To the Soviet Union, it cost something, I think, like 18, 20 billion rubles. It was immense in terms of how much it cost the Soviet Union to try to deal with this mess. Large numbers of workers, military people were involved in dealing with this disaster and the cleanup side. It had a lasting effect on Ukraine, to be perfectly honest. And even now, today, in the last month, as Russian forces invaded Ukraine from the north, from Belarus, they cut through Pripyat, and they went to a Chernobyl nuclear power plant. There was actually some kind of fight there. There's now even an entry on Wikipedia called "The Battle of the Chernobyl Power Plant 2022," which you would never thought you would see.
Yeah.
Chernobyl is currently under Russian control, and Ukraine kept the power plant going, the remaining 3 reactors, and the 4th one had that giant sarcophagus put over it. Part of the reason why is there was electricity shortage in the country and they just couldn't afford to shut down. But nonetheless, the effects were lasting and they were profound, from environmental to the human impact.
That's pretty amazing. Let me follow up first with, did it change the demographics of the region, in your opinion, as far as people being relocated and moving around, at least separate from current Russian military action in the region? Did the accident sort of change the demographic makeup of the people around the plant? Did others move in to replace some of those that left, or is it kind of still the same in that regard?
I'd say that the area wasn't especially populated, but I think more than 50,000 plus people were evacuated at the time. Then an exclusion zone was set up. Over time, there are hotspots there, but in general, the radiation is permissive of passage. That's why you can go there as a tourist. You can spend some time there. And actually, some people began returning to the region in recent years. The fact that demographics is sort of debatable. I think that it created a lot of fear. One of the things about radiation is you can't see it. And when you can't see it, it is very hard to explain to people what the implications are. I'd say that there were probably a tremendous number of elective abortions that took place around that time period.
I had read that, yes.
Yeah, people who weren't sure that they might be affected, what the impacts might be. So there was sort of a cascade wave of demographic impacts, certainly in the region, that you could tie to Chernobyl indirectly, if not directly.
That's pretty powerful. And like you, as somebody who grew up in the Cold War, in the United States, we had the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in the late 1970s, and that generated a lot of fear. But I was far away from that, and I didn't experience it as close and in person, perhaps, as you did from your location. But certainly, the threat of nuclear accidents was always something that sort of overhung the Cold War period, whether it was a nuclear power plant or a submarine or accidental weapon discharges or so forth. So that's a powerful image from the late Cold War. Let me move forward from there to present Russian military operations. And I want to get both your take, Mike, on this, and then Mary's take as someone who's been on the ground who might be able to talk about what might be going on there now. So, Mike, from your perspective as an expert on Russian military strategy, was the Russian entry into the Chernobyl area accidental? Was this on purpose, or it just happened to be in the line of advance that their planning deemed necessary?
It wasn't accidental at all. And it was interesting in the run up to the war, some folks had argued that a Russian incursion from Belarus going directly to Kiev was unlikely because they'd have to get through Pripyat, and that this zone, the marshes around it prevented passage. Yes. But that wasn't true at all. Actually, they immediately cut through the area and through the nuclear power plant. They drove right through Chernobyl along fairly narrow ground line of communication or road, because they were trying to find the fastest, shortest way to get to the capital from Belarus.
Yeah.
And the level of radiation there now actually permits presence for some time, right? There are some particular hotspots, but folks have, I think, a somewhat mistaken notion that this entire area is an exclusion zone and you cannot go in there, or you couldn't move forces through it, which isn't true. They got through it specifically because it's the first place you enter if you're coming in from Belarus on the western side of the Dnieper River.
Okay.
And you want to head south to Kiev. It's basically the first town. Chernobyl's the first town you're going to hit, believe it or not. So there was no other way for them to get there on a short timetable. And that's why they cut through it.
That makes sense. And as you know better than anybody, that whole area, the Pripyat, I'll probably mispronounce it, marsh area, has been known as an obstacle or an area to go around or get through since Napoleon. And certainly in the German invasion, there was always concerns about that area, at least in terms of being an obstacle. Not sure what it's like coming from the other direction, but that all makes good sense. Mary, let me turn to you for just a minute. As Russian forces moved in on the ground, what might they have encountered there at that time? And what might be the potential for damage or danger there? As Mike pointed out, Chernobyl's become kind of a dystopian location for events and so forth. The urban explorer Josh Gates went there a few years ago looking for ghosts. The extreme British fisherman Jeremy Wade has been there fishing for, radiation-altered fish. So we may have a mistaken impression, as Mike suggested. As somebody who's been on the ground there, what would Russian troops have encountered and what potential dangers, if any, does combat in that area pose for the region and for Europe in general?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Mike has already stated. There are 4 nuclear reactors at Chernobyl. None of them are currently active. The last 3 were decommissioned in the year 2000. So instead of a risk to an operational nuclear reactor, this would be more of a risk to spent fuel storage was the main concern. So any damage to the spent fuel storage area, I believe Chernobyl stores about 20,000 spent fuel rods on site.
Okay.
So those are still hot. The radioactivity is decaying and producing this heat, which needs to be cooled to avoid any sort of fire or meltdown. So in order to do that, water needs to be constantly pumping to cool these radioactive spent fuel rods. So the main concern would be that the grid was disconnected from power, which could cool these rods, which happened March 9th. Power was restored to the site by March 14th, and luckily the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's watchdog, they said even though these are not ideal conditions, everything is functioning as normal, and so there's no reason to be alarmed immediately. That being said, further fighting could also damage the sarcophagus. I visited January 2017, so that was right after they added the new safe containment, as they call it, facility that they built over the initial sarcophagus. And that sarcophagus, the additional one, is to allow for a cleanup project that is going to last until 2065. So that cleanup project, they need ventilation for that. The sarcophagus is designed to make sure that there's ventilation and the cleanup project can be carried out, but that there's no leak of radioactivity to the outside air. So any sort of shelling or damage to that sarcophagus could also potentially lead to some sort of nuclear exposure, but it would not be something similar to the initial Chernobyl meltdown in 1986. That would happen, as James Acton and other people have pointed out, much more likely to happen at one of Ukraine's operational nuclear reactors, which I'm happy to get into more. But there are 4 of those, and so those are probably the bigger threat. Anything at Chernobyl, while still serious, would probably not produce any sort of large cloud of radioactivity in Western Europe, as people have pointed out.
Hey, thanks, Mary. That is helpful to know that the use of the word sarcophagus to inter spent nuclear rods and material is perhaps very apt. And I know as Mike pointed out, the initial cost to build that first one was immense. on the already faltering Soviet Union. And then I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that European governments helped finance the production of the second one that you mentioned that was just finished. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay, let's explore that just a little bit more as well, since everyone's time is limited here. First and foremost, Mary, you mentioned that Ukraine has 4 other nuclear power plants that are operational. Are they crucial to supplying energy to a nation that is at war right now? And what other dangers could you go into that could happen as a result of combat? And then we'll go to Mike and get some more specifics. If you could talk about those, that would be helpful. Thanks.
Yes, I would be happy to. And I invite Mike, as a native speaker, to correct my pronunciation of these power plants. Some of them I'll just avoid altogether. But there are 4 nuclear power plants that are operational in Ukraine presently, a total of 15 reactors.
Wow. Okay.
8 of those, and they're kind of spread out, but they're fairly localized around 4 regions. And 8 of those are still presently functioning.
Okay.
Some of them had been turned off to kind of reduce the need to be cooled constantly. So Chernobyl, while a critical nuclear facility, that's one that has been captured by Russia, but they've also captured a second nuclear site, which is operational, Zaporizhzhia.
Okay.
And that is Ukraine's largest nuclear power plant. There was some firefight and shelling around that plant, which was very concerning. I think there was a fire that broke out, but it was on the perimeter of the facility on a training building. Luckily, it did not hit any sort of critical infrastructure that could have caused a reaction or led to a meltdown. So that is a major concern. At that location, apparently they're allowing Ukrainians, the workers at the facility, to take breaks and rotate out in shifts. Luckily, that one seems to be operating normally. And then there are 3 others that are kind of spread out over Ukraine, mostly the west part of Ukraine and southern part of Ukraine. The one that is the second largest is the South Ukrainian power plant.
Okay.
And there was fighting around that one as well. And there were reports that Russian troops were honing in on that one in an attempt to capture it. But as of now, that one remains under Ukrainian control.
Hey, thanks, Mary. Let's shift over to Mike if we can. And Mike, as someone who thinks a lot about Russian military strategy, would the Russian military operations in Ukraine have capture of those nuclear facilities being significant objectives, in your opinion, or more secondary ones?
Well, they're considered critical infrastructure. You see forces going for them intentionally, because if they control the main nuclear power plants, then they have control of a lot of the electricity generation in the country, right? And that gives them considerable leverage potentially over entire regions.
Yeah, absolutely. And do either one of you know how much of Ukraine's overall electrical output is provided by nuclear energy?
I saw a figure that in 2020 it was more than half. So it is a significant portion of Ukraine's power supply.
A lot of the rest is provided through coal burning plants, but they rely on a particular type of coal that is mined in the Donbass, large parts of it that are controlled by Russian-led forces. It's a very specific type of anthracite, which is a schmancy word for coal.
Yes,
that those other power plants depend on, and basically the other place where Ukraine can get it is at a very high price from South Africa. So between controlling a lot of the coal and a significant percentage of nuclear power generation, because they have the Zaporizhzhia plant, which is a significant percentage of overall power generation in Ukraine, it is true that Russian forces have control over a significant lever there when we look at electricity in the country.
Yeah, and considering that Russian forces have taken control, or certainly limited control, of sea coastal areas, that would be an easy way to ship in more coal of any kind. It certainly seems to put a great deal more emphasis on nuclear power as a way for Ukraine to continue to maintain the electricity they're going to need to continue to resist the Russian invasion, as they have done so far. Before we charge into some other topics, let me just wrap up on Russian military operations there. We've talked about some of the dangers potentially involved, the importance of nuclear energy there. There have been other speculation too in some reports I've seen where the Russians might want to capture nuclear waste material for nefarious purposes. That seems to be a bit on the outside because certainly Russia could produce their own nuclear grade devices if needed. Is there any other reason for holding the Chernobyl facility itself, just for the purposes of using anything there, or no?
So I would be interested in hearing what Mike has to say about this. But one point I was going to bring up is that one of the justifications for Moscow's invasion of Ukraine has been this bogus conspiracy theory that Ukraine is trying to develop its own nuclear weapons with the help of the West. So Kremlin spokeswoman Maria Zakharova commented, and this has been parroted by Patrushev, by Lavrov, others in the Russian government, that Ukraine is seeking nuclear weapons and even potentially receiving enriched uranium or plutonium from the West. So there were comments made that holding these nuclear power plants was to prevent Ukraine from trying to, I guess, enrich or form some sort of dirty bomb for use in war, which is, again, completely bogus. And the IAEA, the head of the IAEA came out and said, this is absolutely false. You know, we do inspections of Ukraine all the time and they're in compliance. So absolute conspiracy theory with no evidence.
Hey, thanks, Mary. And as we all know, Ukraine did have a supply of nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, that it got assistance from both Western countries and Russia in disarming. Is that correct? Or am I missing a point of history there?
Yes, that's correct. When the Soviet Union fell apart, they inherited some legacy weapons from the USSR. And so there was an international effort to remove those weapons for non-proliferation reasons, which was considered a big success.
Excellent. Thanks for the follow-up on that. There's certainly been plenty of propaganda out there on this particular story. Okay, Mike, thanks so very much for joining us today. We know that you have to jet off to another engagement, but thanks for providing that additional information, especially on Russian military operations around Chernobyl, and hopefully we'll get you back on the program soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve, and great to be here with you and Mary.
Thanks so much. And with that, we'll go to a short break. And when we come back, we'll talk more about conditions on the ground and what Chernobyl looks like today, 36 plus years after the accident.
Hi, listeners. I'm Nalanthi Samaranayaka, the director of CNA's Strategy and Policy Analysis Program. We study issues ranging from maritime strategy to managing alliances and nuclear policy. We've expanded our work in the past few years to include Arctic strategy and policy analysis and the study of non-traditional security issues, such as women, peace and security, climate change and strategic partnerships, and ocean security. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please check out our webpage, cna.org/strategy.
Okay, and welcome back to Coming In From the Cold. As Mike Kaufman pointed out before he left, the Chernobyl facility has taken on a label of being a dystopian landscape. And as we stated earlier, it's one of those seminal events of the Cold War. It's appeared as a metaphor or a signpost for the end of the Soviet Union. There was even a Star Trek movie in the late 1980s or early 90s, I forget, where the Klingon energy moon explodes. And because of the pollution, the Klingon Empire needs to sue for peace. You know, all of this relating to the downfall of the Soviet Union. Mary, let's come back and talk about your visit on the ground at Chernobyl. We've only ever seen, bits and pieces in documentaries and so forth. I mean, what does it look like there? What did it look like there in 2017? Is it this dystopian landscape that we think, or is there more to it? Thanks.
Yes and no. It's very dystopian. You're walking through all of these abandoned buildings, for instance, abandoned gymnasiums, abandoned factories, kindergartens, apartments. It's very unsettling and tragic in that way. But then, as people often point out, there's also the wilderness in the area has completely thrived, and you see vines growing on everything. So there's kind of this interesting compensation for the lack of humanity in that region. Other life has kind of filled that gap. So yeah, it's a really interesting place to be, and it was a fascinating trip.
That's got to be a fascinating experience, certainly. Abandonment seems to be a recurring theme in Cold War Soviet issues. There's a Soviet town in Svalbard called Pyramidion that was abandoned, not because of any disaster, but because the coal ran out and they quit mining coal. Back to the coal issue again. And everything appears to have just been left in place. There's still pots with dead flowers in them. There's still the last lesson is still on the school chalkboards. So that, at least that part of the dystopian feel is there, that everyone just sort of left. Did you get that feeling at all from some of the places you visited in and around Chernobyl?
Absolutely. You definitely get that sense from all of the buildings that you're walking around. There's the famous Ferris wheel you see, which is kind of an unsettling image. And actually an interesting historical tidbit, I think both of the only remaining statues of Lenin in Ukraine are in Chernobyl because people can't go and tear them down. So I got to see one of the only remaining statues of Lenin. So I got to see that as well. And that was a very cool experience.
Yes, that is pretty cool. There is also a Lenin bust yet in Svalbard as well. There are not many of those. That had to have been a cool experience while you were there. Did you need to wear a dosimeter while on the site and limit your time of exposure?
Yes, I did. When you initially arrive there, you are issued a Geiger counter and a little card that you carry around. And there are 2 checkpoints that you have to cross back and forth between. There's the kind of exclusion zone perimeter, that's the 30-kilometer perimeter. And then there's the closer 10-kilometer perimeter. And so moving in between those, there are certain security protocols you have to take so that you're being safe and they're measuring the dose that you're getting, but also to prevent transporting any of this irradiated soil from one part of Chernobyl to the other. So you clean your shoes or you wear little booties, that sort of thing. And they say that the average exposure that you're going to get on a day-long trip to Chernobyl is not much different than a transatlantic flight in terms of the amount of radiation you'll get. And actually they calculate, I don't remember what my final dose was. I have the card somewhere, but they compared it to eating a certain number of bananas because, bananas have potassium, which is an isotope. And when I was there, it was winter. And so there was snow on the ground, and the hydrogen in the snow actually acted as a shield for a lot of the radiation. Our counts were not as high as some people that go for a 2-day trip and stay overnight in a hotel, that sort of thing. But they did take us around, and we could not go into the nuclear reactor buildings.
Sure.
But we could go around and look at several of the kind of historical points of interest. And there would be certain hotspots, and they would explain this is possibly where one of the liquidators tapped his boot to get some of the dust off, and the dust made this specific point much more radioactive. And so we would take out our Geiger counters, and sure enough, the reads would go up, and then we would move on. Another interesting thing that I saw was this Soviet early warning missile system radar, and it's the Dugo Radar. And so it was massive and just a really interesting, for a nuclear nerd, it was one of the coolest things you could see. So that is on site as well in the exclusion zone. So
another Cold War relic. It's too bad Bill's not here. Bill loves missile and air defense in the Cold War. He'll certainly be interested to hear that as well. Your points about dust are well taken. I saw a report in the last 2 or 3 days that they'd actually measured like a slight increase in the overall background radiation that they thought might have taken place there because, military operations may have stirred up dust, don't know.
Right.
But as you pointed out, it's pretty low already. So maybe we're far enough down the half-life curve there at Chernobyl that we're not facing, imminent danger and catastrophe, just a long lingering cleanup of a messy Cold War legacy that's now further complicated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I think that's right. While the area is very dangerous if you plan to be there for extended periods of time, it is not necessarily posing an immediate threat if you're there for a short period of time, which is why they allow tourists and why they allow scientists to come and take readings. And I did see that about the troop movement kind of causing the dust to unsettle and having these higher than normal readings, which was interesting. It will be a long cleanup effort. It's slated to continue to 2065, but I'm sure it'll continue long after that. And the area will not be habitable for thousands of years, will not be safe for people to live there.
So the legacy of the Cold War continues and will be with us for generations to come. Mary, thanks so much for joining us today. And we already thank Mike, and we'd love to get you back on the program again to talk more about nuclear issues. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And for those of you who would like to learn more about Mary's nuclear weapons expertise, you can follow her on Twitter at nuke_nerd. Is that correct, Mary?
That's right.
Awesome. Thanks to all of you for joining us for another episode of Coming In From the Cold. We look forward to seeing you again for our next program. And in the meantime, stay warm out there.
Coming In From the Cold is produced, edited, and mixed by John Stimson. Our theme music is by Edward Gringa. If you enjoy our show, we'd love it if you'd leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next month.